Olá, bom dia. Estamos começando mais um webinário aqui nessa nossa semana aqui especial de webinários. Hoje é o último dia e hoje a gente tem uma palestra agora, né? A gente atrasou um pouquinho por problemas técnicos, mas já estamos no ar aqui para apresentar mais essa palestra. Eu vou me apresentar primeiramente, eu sou o Guilherme Freitas, sou membro aqui do GEPHOM, né, desse grupo de pesquisa que está organizando esse webinário em parceria com o Centro de Estudos Migratórios, e também sou lá doutorando no NEASH, e hoje a gente vai estar recebendo o Óscar Martínez, que vai fazer uma apresentação sobre migração, principalmente migração de trabalhadores mexicanos. A palestra se chama A Map to Walk Through the City, Social and Labor Insertion Strategies of Young Return Migrants in Mexico City, que o Oscar, ele é Swiss Mexican Chamber of Commerce and Industry Multidisciplinary Research Network for Discrimination Studies in Mexico City e Global Compact for Migration at the United Nations Major Group for Children and Youth in Mexico. Bom, como já deu para perceber, o Oscar vai fazer essa palestra em inglês. Ele vai ter mais ou menos uns 30 minutos para apresentar, ele vai passar também algumas imagens, e nós, depois que ele terminar, a gente vai estar liberado para fazer perguntas, vocês também podem interagir aí através dos comentários. So, Oscar, good morning, good evening. Thank you for accepting our invitation to participate in this webinar. So you have more or less 30 minutes to make your presentation, and after we will make some questions. The public in the comments make questions too. So it's you.
Thank you so much, Guilherme and Felipe, for the invitation. I am delighted to be here. It is an honor to have the opportunity to share with you the results of my research, which is actually part of my BA thesis as an international relations student. So maybe we can go to the next slide.
Just a moment, please.
Yes, sure, no worries. Okay, so the main question of this research is to answer this question: how are the processes of social and labor insertion of young return migrants in Mexico City? And this research question aims to shed light on the effects of different modalities of return on the insertion experience of young migrants in Mexico City, and on the other hand, to determine what are the barriers to social and labor insertion faced by young return migrants in the same urban context. So I'm going to follow this structure of the presentation. I will talk about the evolution of migration policy in the US. Then I will talk about Little LA, the supposed emergence of a binational neighborhood in Mexico City. Then I'll talk about a little bit of the qualitative methodology that I used in this research. And then I will propose a typology of contemporary return for youth. And then I'll talk about the labor and social insertion in a transnational call center to jump into the conclusions. Okay, can we go next slide, please? Sorry, can we just move on to the next slide?
It's not appearing there?
Oh, I don't see it, but maybe the rest can.
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. Then I'm going to continue. Thank you. Well, although mass deportations of Mexicans appear to be a recent phenomenon, it is actually a trend that, with ebbs and flows throughout history, has been present in the relationship between Mexico and the US throughout the 20th century. In fact, it has been recognized that the United States returned at least 1 million Mexicans in the course of the 1930s, which in relative terms reveals a project of expulsion greater than the one we see today, if we consider that about 1.5 million Mexicans lived in the US back then. During the 1950s, Operation Wetback offers another example of mass deportation of Mexicans, since it resulted in around 1 million cases of deportation. However, comparisons between that time and ours are also useless, since Operation Wetback was aimed at returning those who were caught illegally crossing the border. So for these historical examples, it is surprising that some influential academic articles on return migration do not bear in mind deportation as a possible scenario of return. And this is, in my opinion, symptomatic of the status of expulsion procedure, of this expulsion procedure in the context of migration studies. Those who have been interested in explaining transnational human mobility observed and theorized immigration processes and refugee policies and left aside the study of deportation and its historical dimension and as an instrument of population control. Throughout almost the whole 20th century, the average number of people deported from the US was about 18,875 people per year. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And this indicates an annual average of 78,000 per year. In contrast, only in the period between 2009 and 2017, which correspond to the presidency of Barack Obama, the US recorded 3,065,556 deportation events. So in this scenario of mass expulsions, Barack Obama is pointed out by civilian and academic actors as the orchestrator of the significant deportation increase in the US, and the Secure Communities Program as the institutional and bureaucratic instrument that allowed this task. However, the legal modifications to migration governance that enabled the emergence and reach of secure communities must be traced back to the 1990s. The Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 laid the foundations of the upsurge in the US migration policy. On the one hand, this law facilitated the legalization process of nearly 3 million undocumented migrants, and on the other, it made the hiring of undocumented people illegal, and sought to increase security devices at the border. IRCA's objectives were supplemented by the passage of the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act and the Illegal Immigration Reform and Illegal Responsibility Act in 1996, which increased the number of people who could be subjected to deportation because they expanded the list of aggravated felonies. Now, these aggravated crimes include, as of 1996, non-violent theft in an establishment, or the accumulation of 2 lesser counts of drug possession. Once the expulsion machinery is set in motion, it is not possible to appeal to a judge on the specifics of each case, and deportation is pretty much imminent. Thus, policy reports demonstrate that the increase in expulsions and detentions of non-citizens in the US is only one pillar of a sophisticated and complex system of migration governance that began to be orchestrated at the end of the last century, and that it counts with the support of key decision makers in both parties, and also, as we've experienced recently, the support of the general public. Can we go to the next slide, please? The significant increase in expulsions in a short period of time requires the mobilization of an enormous amount of state resources to be able to carry it out. Political and economic capital, management of alliances between both national and international actors, and so on. So an investigation by the Migration Policy Institute reveals that the annual expenditure invested in the implementation of migration procedures exceeds the sum of the federal budget allocated to the rest of the government security agencies. Between 1896 and 2013, the US government has allocated 187 billion to the implementation of immigration law. And in fiscal year 2012 alone, this number represented nearly 25% more resources than the FBI, the DEA, the Secret Service, the US Marshal, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives together. For this reason, the massification of deportation must be understood as an extension of population governance strategies which reserve the right to admission to society. Can we go to the next slide, please?
Yes.
So this is the one with little LA on the title, right? Yes, perfect.
Yes.
Okay.
That's right.
So what have these policy changes meant for undocumented Mexican youth living in the US? So I would like us to read the article, the title of this newspaper article, which reads, "In Little LA, Deported Dreamers Build the American Dream." Now, this is the headline of an article in a major national newspaper, probably the most important Mexican newspaper. And this suggestive statement is immediately expanded by a more specific subtitle, "A place where repatriated migrants meet and open businesses." With these preliminary indications, the article accounts for the emergence of a binational and bilingual neighborhood quietly built by a growing population of deported migrants in the Tabacalera neighborhood of Mexico City. In an interview, the director of the NGO of returned migrants that promotes the idea of Little LA in Mexico estimates that more than 1,000 people deported from the US meet in this neighborhood in the center of the Mexican capital for work and housing reasons. Similarly, other national and international newspaper articles began to report the same phenomenon. And the explanation they offer is quite similar. The importance of the Tabacalera neighborhood as an area of recreation and social congregation occurred as a process of gentrification. The cafes were followed by startups, co-working places, and call centers. Most of the newspaper articles on the subject characterize the area surrounding the Monument to the Revolution, which is the Tabacalera neighborhood, as a place for labor and social insertion of returned migrants who are described to be deported or returned. Thus, a report entitled "Little LA, the Neighborhood of Deportees" presents the Tabacalera neighborhood as an incipient zone of binational people where deported men and women congregate to find something that connects them with their lives on the other side. So at the beginning of this investigation, these journalistic descriptions of the Tabacalera neighborhood outlined it as an ideal research site to report on the experiences of social and labor insertion of young people who were deported or returned from the US and who began to congregate in a specific urban space in Mexico. And this was relevant in the design of the research because, according to researcher Natalie Poitz, ethnographic writing on deportation involves a series of ethical and methodological considerations, beginning with the spatial location of people who went through inherently exclusive experiences. So in November 2018, when I began my first ethnographic observation tours throughout the Tabacalera neighborhood, I realized that the idea of Little LA is somehow difficult to hold. After several days walking the streets of the locality, I was able to verify that there were not too many Tex-Mex food stalls, hairdressers, or tattoo studios referred to in the journalistic notes. English-speaking people were not abundant on the streets either. And even the owner of a shoe store in the neighborhood, a must stop in the Little LA tour, explained to me that he had been deported from the US, but only after spending a month in that country, and suggested that it would be better if I spoke with the workers of the call center located in front of the Monument to the Revolution, who probably lived in the US for longer. Illustratively, a short time later, when I was a volunteer at the NGO that promotes the idea of the binational neighborhood in the Tabacalera area, a direct message received through the Facebook page asked, "Can someone please help me find Little LA? I've been looking around the Monumento a la Revolución for a while and I can't find anything." So as time went on, not just the idea of Little LA was confronted, also the very emphasis on deportation that characterizes the return narrative used by the civil association in which I participated as a volunteer, and which is reproduced in the journalistic comments that aroused my curiosity. Little by little, I realized that the deportation, the international phenomenon of forced migration, whose consequences I had proposed to study, was not the rule, but the exception in the return experience of most of the young people with whom I began to interact. And this was in contrast to the information released by the journalistic notes that I just described that inspired the initial questions of this research. This doesn't mean, however, that deportation is not a significant cause of return of large numbers of Mexicans who used to live in the US. However, at the beginning of this research, not many young people with whom I spoke felt identified with the experience of deportation, since they did not go through it themselves. Consequently, to estimate a more exact number of people who have been forced to return to Mexico, it is not necessary to take into account other experiences of forced return through which young people have been forced to leave their lives behind in the US and start a new one in Mexico. It is relevant and suggestive to account for the scenarios of contemporary return of binational youth and their processes of social and labor insertion, since their life trajectories question basic notions of return conceived as a stage of the migratory cycle. The very use of the verb return is inadequate to account for the experience of many binational youth due to the fact that they were taken to the US in early childhood and their memories of the beginning of their life in Mexico are little or actually non-existent. Likewise, the characterization of this process as return could imply that whoever returns has knowledge of the values, the culture, and the institutions of the society to which they return. However, the environment in which migrant people return is different from what they were exposed when they left. Therefore, return migrants go through a process of readjustment that responds to specific contexts of the host society, which begins by reaffirming their socioeconomic status as a crucial determinant of a successful reintegration process. The analytical relevance of pondering the modalities in which binational youth return to Mexico lies in the fact that even within the same urban environment, it has been recognized that the effects of return are differentiated due to the contexts and the conditions that shape it. If space-time life experiences define who we are and the way we relate with the world, it is convenient to investigate the modalities of return experienced by binational youth, as they could account for different processes of social and labor insertion. For researcher Kristen Wethley, for instance, the economic and social challenges faced by deportees and returnees in Mexico are actually very similar. Despite this, the reincorporation process between the two groups differs in the following. Those who return voluntarily tend to return with greater economic resources than those who are forced to do so, and they tend to face the stigma associated with deportation to a lesser extent. So throughout talks and daily contact with young return migrants in Mexico City, I realized that contrary to the diagnosis of some activists and journalistic reports, that the accounts of their return experiences are not legally configured nor narrated by them as deportations. Can we go to the next slide, please?
Sure.
So through indirect comments about the reasons why they returned to Mexico, I realized that many of my interlocutors did not go through a deportation process, but rather that US immigration authorities deported or intimidated one of their parents. And, or they did not quite integrate into American society, for which their parents were forced or opted for voluntary return, and the children returned to Mexico accordingly. This phenomenon, which I like to call multiplied return, could be perceived as an unintended and secondary effect of a direct deportation mechanism, but it could also be understood as an anticipated result of population governance strategies in the US. It can be argued that the interpretation of the migration phenomenon through the lens of national security in the US has resulted in the forced return of a population much larger than we recognize in official documents on the subject, and highlights the direct deportation or removal is not the only contemporary forced return mechanism. In addition, the social group that stands out for being the main target of deportations in the US are Latino working class men. And this shows the play of racial, but also of gender profiles at the heart of the expulsion logic, which has fundamental consequences for the families of people removed or deported, since it is evident that the expulsion of a person implies, on the one hand, the separation of the family, of the person who is deported, or if not, the return of part of the family cell or of its entirety. So the multiplication of forced return could have relevant effects on the way in which binational youth, once in Mexico, insert themselves socially and professionally in a changing and in many cases unknown urban environment. Can we go to the next slide, please?
Yes.
Now, the qualitative method used in this research is the life trajectory. The analytical value of the trajectory as a theoretical methodological tool for this research lies in the fact that, unlike other qualitative methods, notably the discourse analysis and the biography, this one allows us to intertwine in a focused way the historical conditions in which a migrant person lives and their migration experience. Thus, the life trajectory as an instrument for analysis allows us to systematize and interpret observations of specific moments in a person's biography and to link segments of individual experiences with long-term historical processes. The life trajectory operates under the principle of analytically incorporate the social, legal, and international contexts as relevant to historical location of individual events, identify transitions and patterns of regularity between individuals through the same time intervals, and since it has the claim to interpret the social world from individual life experiences. Thus, everyday events in life, in the life of a migrant person, intersect with the material and historical conditions of the site of transnational circuit in which an event takes place. In empirical terms, the instrumentalization of the life trajectory led me to design an interview script that allowed me to later encapsulate specific biographical aspects of the lives of the young people with whom I spoke. This script helped me at first to segment life experiences based on migration and return trajectories, and to establish links with the evolution of migration policy in the United States and the conditions of the labor market in Mexico City. So the questions that I prepared for this interview gave me the possibility to explore different aspects of the life experience of young people with whom I spoke, the beginning of the migratory trajectory, identity, return experience, labor insertion, social insertion, and so on. And the inputs of this research work came mainly from 11 life trajectory interviews to whom I refer to as young return migrants. Can we go to the next slide, please?
Yeah.
So these young return migrants are young people between 21 and 30 years old who returned to Mexico City between 2012 and 2018 after having spent most of their lives in the US, and have remained in the city ever since. In addition to the information provided in the interviews, this research benefits from reflections based on my own experiences acquired through contact with young return migrants for 5 months as I volunteered in the NGO that focuses on return migration. And in addition to the information that comes from the life trajectory interviews and the ethnographic observation process, the research is complemented with 6 semi-structured interviews with people who have daily interactions with return migrants, but unlike them, with the exception of the parents, of course, have no international migration experience in the US. And some examples of these relationships are work colleagues or other volunteers in civil associations and partners. Can we go to the next slide, please?
Yes.
Now, from this is a conceptual proposal, right? This is the table that you can see. Yes, is it the case? Is that the case? Yeah, okay.
Yes,
Okay,
sorry.
perfect. Thank you. Okay, from my conversations with young return migrants, I realized that their return experiences are cut crossed by two fundamental axes. A conceptual framework on the contemporary return of binational youth would have to distinguish between voluntary and involuntary return. However, none of the young return migrants I interviewed reported having returned to Mexico as a result of a voluntary decision. And this seems to be a widespread sentiment among youth with lifelong trajectories in the US. And on the other hand, given that in many cases, young return migrants depend economically on family networks to subsist in the US, it is also necessary to consider whether the decision or obligation to return fell on them, or whether their arrival in Mexico is a result of the return of someone else, namely their parents. Now, this is what I want to outline with the direction of return, whether direct or indirect. And based on the return experiences of my interlocutors, I prepared the table that you can see now as a conceptual proposal that allows us to identify 4 contemporary return scenarios, starting from the premise that the will, on the one hand, and the direction, on the other hand, of the act of returning are axes that have explanatory power that account for the modalities of return and for the processes of social and labor insertion. Before a specific explanation of each scenario, it is relevant to mention that the conceptual categories in the table are not definitive, nor do they exhaustively reflect the motivations behind binational youth's return, since I also observed that the boundaries that separate these categories can be easily blurred in the narratives of return experiences, as narrated by the same actors. So in other words, in some interviews, I received contradictory information about the modality of return, and due to ethical considerations, I did not try to deepen into them. So, okay, I will begin with the explanations of the 4 scenarios. The first 2 conceptual scenarios referred to in the table correspond to 2 classic return. The first category, truly voluntary return, is similar to that characterized by migration neoclassical theory as a return product of a rational decision, and has been academically described as a return scenario that best lays the foundations for insertion processes because it implies preparation in terms of saving economic resources and possible mobilization of networks at the destination site. Now, none of the youth with whom I spoke felt affinity with this category, which is an indication that most of the contemporary return experiences of binational youth in Mexico City are involuntary. The second category, voluntary return or repatriation, is a form of direct return because it was a young return migrant who went through it, and it is an involuntary process because, as I was able to verify in the interviews, it is sudden and undesired circumstance because they didn't contemplated returning to Mexico. And I was also able to realize that it is an event that has consequences for emotional stability and mental health of those who experience it. And therefore, it seems to me that this is a process that limits the most the possibilities of insertion process. The third return scenario that I identified can be exemplified through the story of Valeria, a 23-year-old binational young woman living in Mexico City who returned because her father made the decision to return with his entire family due to having an unpleasant encounter with US migration authorities that led him to no longer want to live in that country. Consequently, Valeria's return to Mexico City is indirect, while she did not make the decision to return, and at the same time, it is voluntary, because although she would have preferred to continue with her life in the US, she considered that it was best for her family to begin a new life in Mexico, even though she knew beforehand that she would face many obstacles since she moved to the US when she was 3 years old, and she had never experienced life in Mexico. In the opinion of Valeria, who works in a call center, her story is similar to that of many binational colleagues who work with her, that are not deported themselves, but the circumstances push them to return voluntarily. This scenario of the return of binational youth is somehow elusive because the boundaries between the will and the obligation to return are blurred, since in reality it is reasonable to question whether it is truly a voluntary decision and not rather an involuntary process motivated by structural forces. However, this modality of return favors the social and labor insertion due to the social and economic resources that they may have at hand. And finally, the fourth proposed return scenario has to do with the voluntary deportation or repatriation of the parents, which has the consequences of family separation and multiplied forced return. One fact that enhances this scenario of multiplied return is the existence of racial and gender profiles behind events of immigration, detention, and deportation, as I said, in such a way that it has come to be considered that the deportation crisis affects working class male Latinos due to the fact that the distribution of the traditional work usually positions men as an important source of income for a family unit. For this reason, scholars are surprised by the fact that the academic literature on migration has made significant critical contributions on how certain social and political issues are articulated as threats to security, but has not made explicit the racial dimension at the heart of the logic of deportation and voluntary repatriation. Unlike the second scenario of this conceptual table, the deportation of one of the parents could have similar implications for the process of social and labor insertion for young return migrants, because the activation of support networks in the destination site is not anticipated, and available economic resources are invested in the US to prevent deportation from being consumed. However, this modality of return may not have such profound consequences for the mental health of binational youth, since it is experienced indirectly. Can we go to the next slide, please? So all the people I spoke with had their first work experience in a call center, and almost all of them shared the fact that their first work experience occurred in a call center called T-Tech in the Tabacalera neighborhood. An informant who worked in this very same call center, although without having international migration experience, mentioned that in his opinion, about 80% of the call center workers lived in the US for most of their lives. Thus, a strategy to reduce operating costs, transnational call centers that serve US market hire young return migrants in Mexico, and the vast majority of them have found an important livelihood in this industry. There are many reasons that explain why young return migrants work in call centers. An important reason are the prospects for continuing studies in Mexico. Not many of the young people with whom I spoke have the desire to continue academic studies. Actually, they are interested in finding a job that helps them save money to start their own business. However, those who want to access higher education face the limited offer of spaces in public universities. And since they don't speak Spanish, they have more difficulties to approve standardized tests in Spanish that often have sections of Mexican history that they don't know. So given the impossibility of accessing a university, it is more convenient for them to look for a job to receive income with which to pay for a private university. Another reason is labor market discrimination. Many of the young return migrants have tattoos on their faces and piercings on their ears, and in general, a specific outfit for which many of them feel discriminated against when they look for a job. In contrast, call centers don't have a dress code in their offices, and all workers can dress as they like. Another reason is that requirements to work in call centers, unlike in other jobs, have been are not as strict as in other industries. So, for instance, in the tourism industry, that they could also in which they could also participate. So, call centers don't request proof of studies of any kind, nor do they ask for questions about criminal records or immigration trajectories. The only requirement to enter is to be able to speak English fluently and to deeply understand American culture. And they do, and consequently it is easier for them to find a job in a call center. Another reason is the salary difference compared to other sectors, and unlike the construction sector, in which urban return migrants of previous generations were typically inserted, the call center industry offers more competitive salaries and in some cases also labor benefits such as health insurance. And there are also consequences for the social world. Young return migrants interact primarily with other young return migrants that they meet in the workspaces. So working hours are very long in the call centers, and only one day and they only have one day in the week to rest. And for this reason, it is very common that their immediate work environment, made up of other young return migrants, is also their closest social circle, since they don't see the relatives with the same regularity. And now I'm gonna jump to the conclusions. And here I only have two conclusions. So given the characteristics of entering the call center industry, young return migrants can find a job in this industry regardless of their characteristics of their return. The only and most important requirement, as I said, is to speak English fluently and to know the cultural codes of American society. And this is very important for young return migrants when they come to Mexico City, because they don't even have an ID document that verifies that this person is this person. And in the call center, this is not a requirement. And that's why they are able to find a job there. And paradoxically, despite the fact that the bodies of the young return migrants were physically removed from the US, directly or indirectly, their skills continue to be used and benefit the US job market. This is a paradox that I find very disturbing. Well, in sum, a young migrant returning to Mexico City faces the same precarious conditions of the labor market that any other young person without migratory experience faces. And to this is added the lack of information to navigate the social and labor world to which they are working. So thank you so much. This was the end of my presentation. In the next slide is the bibliography, I believe. And in the very last one, I have some contact information in case you want to have, a word about this topic. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm ready to your comments.
Okay, thank you, Oscar, for this presentation. Very, very nice, and the facts of your presentation. So this is a historical relationship between Mexican and Americans, and have a lot of questions about identity, migration, and have the case of the people who live many years in America and go to Mexico and didn't have like feel dislocated because they don't speak the Spanish, don't in the identification like as Mexican. So this is have a lot of difficulties we were talking about too. And we have some questions here. Let me see. So we have questions about our colleagues of GEPHOM, our researchers group. So the first question.
Guilherme, can I do a question?
Okay, go ahead.
Yes. So Oscar, as you already know, I had the experience to go to Mexico 2 years ago, and it's funny because what we get used to read and to see in the newspapers, in the television, here about the migratory dynamic between the U.S. and Mexico is totally different in the real life, if we can say this. So what we see in local in Mexico is that there are a lot of people that go back and forth daily through the border, and a lot of people that have half of their life in Mexico and half of their life in the U.S. So I would like to know if you know if these dreamers, these returned migrants, they have by any means they compose communities throughout the border, by the border, like in cities like Monterrey and Tijuana, and still living half of their life in the U.S., going back and forth daily. Like there are workers that live in Tijuana that work in San Diego, that live up in the north in Monterrey, that works in El Paso or Corpus Christi, and just came in the end of the day to Mexico. Do you have an idea if there are a huge community of these dreamers, these returned people by the border?
Oh, sorry, I think you freezed. Maybe I'm having internet connection problems, but I think I got your question, Felipe. Thank you for asking that. How could I answer this? So yes, of course there are cities in Mexico, especially along the U.S. border, the border with the U.S., that in which life is shared, right, between Mexico and the U.S. My research, however, focuses on life in Mexico City, a city that is pretty much not in the middle of the country. It's a bit down south, but we have no border with the U.S., right? So these are people who live in Mexico City because they think, okay, I don't have any chances to go back to the U.S. because for that I need my passport, right? If I don't have a passport, even though even though I live in a border city, if I don't have a passport, if I don't have a visa, if I don't have this document that would allow me to go through it, I won't be able to cross, right? So they don't have this document for many reasons. So they decide to go to Mexico City. They may not be originally from Mexico City. They might be from even a trans-border city. But since they don't have the possibility to live this trans-migratory life, they decide to establish in Mexico City and find a job there and start a new life there. So yes, that's to answer your question.
Thank you.
So, Oscar, we have a question here of Professor Valeria, of our colleague of GEPHOM. So the first question is, do you have data about how many if then has tried to return to US by crossing the border using coyote service? And I have 3 questions, but if you like, I ask you one of one or other. Okay, so go ahead in this question about if you have data about how many of them try to return to US by using a coyote service. have research about that?
Well, for that, I only know an ethnographic and historic ethnographic research by a PhD student that actually was granted a very renowned award in the US, that actually focuses on the work of coyotes and their role in these transactions. This is actually a history of the work of the coyotes, so it might be interesting to go to history, right, to answer these questions. But about the numbers, I'm not really sure. I also have the impression that with this topics regarding migration, it is also very difficult to measure everything, right? Because you know, as I was explaining earlier, the government offers one number, but then if you look closer, it's actually more, and then it is almost impossible to quantify this migration, human movement. So that, in that sense, I think it would be better to access an ethnographic approach to it that might not offer an exact number of how many people are trying to cross the border with coyotes, but they might offer the essence of the dynamic that they go through.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another question is about the people who go to Mexico. Have any program from Mexican government to reintegrate these people in the society, the Mexican society?
This is a great question, actually, and it's also part of my research. I just didn't have time, or it would have been too long to talk about this. But yes, the Mexican government, the government of Mexico City, recently developed this program about for receiving returned migrants. However, the long-lasting critique from academia has always been that all these the proposed programs, and actually the current one, are very short-term oriented, and we conceive return not as a moment in which a person comes back to Mexico and we say, okay, this person returned, he needs money to, I don't know, for whatever reasons, and we'll give them money for 3 months. We conceive return as a long-term process that is experienced differently by different return migrants, right? So it is not the same. It is not the same if you are an old man or a young person. And what I'm trying to say here is that the government strategies to address this issue do not recognize the diversity of the profiles of return migrants. And even within, I also realized that even within the group that I don't want to say that I study, that the group that I chose to write my thesis on is very diverse as well, right? So there are also, if we could also establish different typologies of young return migrants in Mexico City, it is not a homogeneous group, and so is the case with the whole group of return migrants. So yes, there are some strategies by the Mexican government that on one hand are, as I said, short-term oriented, and that don't recognize the diversity of the population that they try to reach. So yeah.
Okay, so the last question of Valeria is regarding new interviews. How receptive has these people to tell you their stories?
Oh my, Valeria, thank you so much for your questions. I consider them actually crucial to talk more about the challenges, the many challenges that I faced in this research. So when I became interested in this project, in this topic, I thought that it might be easy to to establish connections with young people, as I am also young and I am also interested, and I wanted to participate in an NGO that works with return migrants, so that it's not only me taking the information but also trying to contribute to the society, so to say. But I faced many barriers to try to get the information. So I was actually, I will be honest with you, I was actually a bit disappointed when I realized that I only had 11 interviews. That sounds like it's not really that much, and you don't get to say strong statements with the information you get out of only 11 interviews. But it was very hard for me to establish these connections on the one hand, and on the other hand, this is a hot topic, right? Also, and a reason, and okay, and something that has been happening is that U.S. scholars are also growing their interest in this topic. So what they do is they come to Mexico with their generous budgets of their universities. They are fully funded, and they can offer money in exchange of the interviews. So what I faced in the field was that when I tried to approach a young return migrant, he or she was expecting me to give some monetary exchange, right, for the information. So this is a practice that I think is very, it really damages the academic work of non-funded researchers, and especially students that, I mean, we don't have money to offer the people, and it is also quite ethically questionable, right? So yes, I encountered many difficulties, and actually the 11 interviews, my precious 11 interviews that I have, I got them because I really got to know the people before I asked them for an interview. So working at the NGO was very helpful for me, because I got to know people on a deeper level, not just, you know, just two random people that know anything about each other, and I just say, oh, I wanna know what are your experiences that are often traumatic, and it's something that you don't easily get to tell to other people that you just met. So yeah.
Okay, so Valeria sent a message here and congrats you, because the number of 11 is very good number of interviews.
Thank you, Valeria.
And I have one curiosity. It's more your opinion. So about this new government in America, the government of Biden. So how you expected this new government in this relation of migration between Mexican and America?
Okay, so this is
More
real.
your opinion.
Well, as someone who studied international relations, I must say that well, the president doesn't get to choose absolutely the migration policy, right? There are other factors. Of course, it is important that the president has certain views and so on, but there are other political actors that influence this process. I would say that the Biden administration will try to show a watered down version of what the Trump administration had been doing regarding immigration enforcement, because this is a way to distance from the past, and to show the constituency that this is a different government, right? And especially considering the fact that the Trump administration made of migration a key issue of the presidency, right? So it's definitely very important that Biden distances himself from the past. However, I don't really see a significant change in this administration. However, I am optimistic in terms of this project that Biden has to address the root causes of migrations in Central America. This is something that the Mexican government tried to do as well at the beginning of this new of the AMLO administration back in 2018, with the support of many other governments, of many UN institutions and so on, and it failed because it didn't get the support of the US, and then the coronavirus came and it ruined it all. So this is another opportunity, yet another Central America strategy to address the root causes of migration that I really don't know how well it could work. However, the political will is there, and this is a good sign, in my opinion.
Okay, let me see. I think we didn't have more questions. So, Felipe, do you have more questions for Oscar?
Yes, I do. Oscar, what's your opinion about the Lopez Obrador administration in migratory terms?
Well, for AMLO's government, migration is really a secondary topic, right? We are not focused on this topic at all. And we have more important, well, the president has a different agenda than focusing on migration. It is definitely not there. If the AMLO government opened the presidency with this plan to address the root causes of migration in Central America, was due to the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Marcelo Ebrard, which is likely to become the next president of Mexico. And he does really have this global vision, and he does care about migration, and he thinks this topic is important. However, for President Andrés Manuel, this is not a key issue, and especially not so in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Mexico has been strongly hit by the pandemic, and if we had an austerity program even before the pandemic, now all of the resources are, or most of the resources, not all of them, of course, most of the resources are being directed to the health sector. So migration has been really left behind. However, for instance, Mexico is also a transit country, right? We are a sending country, a receiving country, and a transit country, and we've experienced an increase in the applications in the asylum seeker applications, and I was very happy and very surprised to see that when the outbreak started back in March, it hit us in Mexico. The Mexican Commission for Refugees Assistance, this institution that recognizes and concedes the status of refugee, didn't shut its doors, didn't stop to work, and this was very exceptional in the global context. So I remember this note of Filippo Grandi, the UNHCR head commissioner, congratulating the Mexican government for continuing its determination to improve the conditions of refugees and asylum seekers and so on. So, but this was not a decision that AMLO himself made. This was a decision that he delegated to others because he's not really focused or interested in that topic. So that would be my not that short answer.
Okay, thank you, Oscar. So we have more questions, and we have a good presentation here. So, Oscar, congratulations for your presentations. Very rich details for us. The fact of this migration, this historical relationship between Mexico and Americans. And thank you so much to accept our invitation to participate. And this presentation, you will stay here in Facebook and YouTube. If you need this link to send for someone, is there in this Facebook. And then, thank you so much, and thank you for Felipe and for other people who make a question here for us in the Facebook. And so we ended this presentation here, and we have one more presentation at night with Felipe and Professor Ivaldo. They were talking about the case of Rwanda, migration, and a lot of things, identity. And so, thank you, Óscar. Obrigado a todo mundo, né, que acompanhou aí. Vai ter mais uma palestra agora à noite, né, do Felipe e do professor Ivaldo, e a partir das 7. Então, fiquem ligados, e essa palestra vai estar salva também aqui no Facebook, para quem quiser assistir e enviar depois. Obrigado a todos.